Hi, my name's Monica Hershberger, and I'm a PhD candidate in historical musicology at Harvard University. I'm currently putting the finishing touches on my dissertation entitled American Operatic Heroines, Staging National and Feminist Identities During the Cold War. So over the course of my research on this project, I've gotten to know 4 American operatic heroines incredibly well. And I'm excited today to introduce you to one of these women, Lizzie Borden. She's the protagonist of Jack Beeson's opera, Lizzie Borden, A Family Portrait. The New York City Opera Company premiered Lizzie Borden on March 25, 1965. There was also a televised production of the opera that was made, and it was first telecast in January of 1967. And I'm especially eager to show you some excerpts from this televised production, which was released on DVD in 2013. But first, let's get to know Lizzie a little better. You may recognize the name Lizzie Borden because she was indeed a real person. She was born in Fall River, Massachusetts, and she became famous, infamous really, when on August 4th, 1892, someone brutally murdered her father and stepmother in their Fall River home. The murder weapon appears to have been an axe or a hatchet. The Fall River murders were widely reported in newspapers throughout the country, and they shocked Americans. They shocked Americans because they were so gruesome. And I can show you some of the crime scene photos. So this is Abbie Durfee Borden, Lizzie's stepmother. She was discovered face down in one of the upstairs bedrooms. We think she suffered 19 direct blows to the back of her head. This is Andrew Jackson Borden, Lizzie's father. He was discovered in the living room, slumped across the sofa. We think he suffered 10 or 11 hatchet blows. So it was a really gruesome scene. It was 32-year-old Lizzie who discovered her parents' mangled bodies and who cried out for help. But it was also Lizzie who was later arrested, tried, but then finally acquitted of the crimes. In the court of public opinion, however, Lizzie has generally remained guilty. Now it's true there are some people who maintain her innocence, but by and large the general consensus seems to be that she did it and she got away with it. So in addition to being a historical figure, Lizzie Borden has become something of an American legend. Maybe you're familiar with the children's rhyme, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Despite its inaccuracies, the number of whacks is not correct. The rhyme remains popular, and I think it sums up public opinion regarding Lizzie's guilt rather succinctly. Jack Beeson and his librettist actually incorporated this rhyme into the very end of their opera. So let's take a look at the opera now. Interestingly, the idea for this work came not from an American, but from a German who was struggling to come to terms with the Holocaust. Richard Plant, his German surname was Plaut, emigrated to the United States during World War II. He was a writer, born in Frankfurt, the son of a Jewish physician. In 1933, his father encouraged him to flee Germany, and so he went first to Basel, Switzerland, and then to New York. Meanwhile, his parents, his father and stepmother, committed suicide to avoid the concentration camps. And throughout his life, Plant struggled with the fact that he had lived while his parents had died. In 1948, he published his first book, The Dragon in the Forest, which was a fictionalized account of his childhood in Frankfurt, which coincided with Hitler's rise to power. I think Richard Plant's life and work is important because it informed his approach to Lizzie Borden as an operatic heroine. Plant suffered from what we might call survivor guilt, and as we'll see in just a moment, when he discovered Lizzie Borden in 1945, he became really attached to her, and it appears that he grew to identify with her. He truly believed that she was guilty. He believed that she'd killed her parents, just as he felt guilty for not doing enough to save his. So Plant mulled over the idea of an opera based on Lizzie Borden for about 9 years, until 1954, when he finally approached a composer. And he picked Jack Beeson, who was teaching in the music department at Columbia University. And Beeson was immediately intrigued by the idea, so the pair began working on their opera. They worked steadily until 1959, when Plant was hospitalized. In 1986, Beeson published an article about the making of Lizzie Borden, and he talked about why Plant was hospitalized. It was because of depression. And Beeson saw Plant's depression as being directly related to his heartbreaking family history. This is what he had to say. During the 6 years we had lived with the Borden family of Fall River, shaping facts to fit fantasies, Richard's European reticence occasionally permitted fleeting references to the Plout family of Frankfurt on Main. The Catholic mother had died in 1932. Richard fled to Basel in 1933. No entreaties could induce the Jewish father to leave the still flourishing medical practice in the homeland, but perhaps one could have been more forceful? By 1938, it was too late to emigrate, and in desperation, Plout took his own life and that of Richard's stepmother, with means easily available to a physician. So Beeson argued that he could plainly see the parallels between the Borden family and the Plout family, namely the strong, obdurate fathers, the stepmothers, the imagined patricide and matricide, and the guilt of survivors. And so in Beeson's mind, Plant was reading his family history into and through the Borden family history. And then in writing Lizzie's libretto, Plant was working through his sense of responsibility for his parents' deaths. On June 15, 1960, Plant wrote a letter to Beeson where he hinted that he might not be well enough to finish the libretto. And sadly, by 1961, things had only worsened in terms of Plant's mental health. And so he did step aside, leaving Beeson to find another librettist. So Beeson picked Kenward Elmsley, with whom he'd collaborated previously. When Elmsley came into the picture, Lizzie became somewhat different as an operatic heroine. So for Plant, she was a figment of his experience and imagination that he hoped would help to free him from his past. But for Elmsley and for Beeson, who didn't have that same kind of connection, she was simply a woman driven over the edge. So in the opera, Lizzie Borden is a woman who does the unthinkable to escape an utterly untenable domestic situation. Her stepmother is a horrible woman who delights in making Lizzie and her younger sister miserable. And her father is also a really hard and cruel man. There's one point in the opera where her father makes fun of Lizzie for being an old maid. She's 32 years old and she's not married. And he shakes her like a rag doll. And it's actually kind of difficult to watch. So there's a sense in which in the opera, Lizzie becomes a victim of abuse and domestic violence. And I actually find myself, as the opera progresses, really rooting for Lizzie, wishing for Lizzie, just pick up the axe and, do the deed. When Lizzie's younger sister Margaret starts plotting her escape with this dreamy sea captain, that's when Lizzie finally snaps, killing her parents so that she doesn't have to remain alone under their roof. And so in one sense, we might think of the operatic Lizzie as a symbol of women's liberation. Remember, this is 1965, just 2 years after the publication of Betty Friedan's landmark study, The Feminine Mystique. And with Lizzie, we have a woman who literally gets to hack to death patriarchal oppression. Pretty cool, right? But there's one problem, because in the world of the opera, in order to commit the murders, Lizzie has to be crazy. She has to be insane. And the opera includes a mad scene, which, as you may know, is a long-standing operatic tradition often used to explain or contain women who act out or resist conventions. We're going to examine 2 moments in the opera that speak to the points that I've just argued. So first we'll watch the beginning of Act 2 as Abbie performs a parlor song. And this will give you a sense of how obnoxious Abbie is as a character. So what you'll hear first is a gentle arpeggiated accompaniment typical of 19th century keyboard writing. And then you'll hear Abbie, played by Ellen Fall, as she sings Beeson's imitation of a 19th century parlor song. The song's about birds and love and springtime. And then you'll see Lizzie, played by Brenda Lewis, going through an old trunk. And then the camera will pan back to Abbie, who appears seated at the harmonium, accompanying herself as she performs this song. So let's watch. This is from the production that was telecast in 1967. Now, I want to give you a taste of how Beeson has Abbie embellish the subsequent verses of this song. So we'll watch just one more verse, and you'll hear how Abbie adds all of these super exaggerated, almost ridiculous ornamentations. So for example, she adds some swoops between notes. She has this one overzealous chromatic descent that spans more than an octave. It's really over the top. Lizzie's going to enter the living room while Abbie's singing. So I want you to pay attention to her facial expression, and you'll notice immediately just how much she detests her stepmother. Interestingly, this was the song that Kenward Elmsley started with when he joined the Lizzie Borden project in 1961. So Plant had already started drafting lyrics for the number, but in a letter that Plant later wrote to Elmsley, he credits Elmsley with being the one to really turn Abbie into just the epitome of the evil, scheming stepmother in this number. So one of the things that I didn't show you in the preceding clips is the way that in between the verses, Abbie kind of charms Andrew into giving her things that she wants. So by the end of the song, she's convinced Andrew that he should get her a new piano, that he should buy her new furnishings for the living room. And if you watch the entire opera, which I hope you will, you'll notice that Andrew is willing, or can at least be convinced, to buy things for his wife, but he never buys things for his daughters. Now I'd like to show you the end of Lizzie's mad scene. So the mad scene occurs near the end of Act 2, after Lizzie's father finishes a round of bullying her. And so Andrew heads upstairs, he leaves Lizzie alone in the darkened living room, and Lizzie continues the abusive ritual that she's just endured with him, but in her head. And you notice as the scene progresses how Lizzie's imprisonment, both physical and mental, becomes increasingly apparent. And it's the very end of the mad scene that I think is the crucial part, because at the very end, Lizzie basically gives up herself. She wraps herself up in the rug from the living room floor, almost covering herself completely, as she makes the switch from first person to the more detached third person perspective. And the lyrics to listen for here are, "I'll breathe water, swallow earth. Lizzie has a body, Lizzie has a head. Lizzie's cut to pieces, Lizzie must be dead."
What is to be done? What is to be done? I'll burrow like a mole in a mound of blood. Oh, dread leaves, and I'll hide there, hide. I'll breathe water, swallow earth. Lizzie has a body, Lizzie has a head. Lizzie's cut to pieces, Lizzie must be dead.
So we just watched the last minute and a half of the mad scene. The entire mad scene is about 10 minutes, and this is typical for operatic mad scenes. One of the things that makes the mad scene difficult is not only the length, but how lonely mad scenes tend to be. And with respect to Lizzie, this is something that performers have commented on. So I spoke with Phyllis Pansella, who sang the role of Lizzie at the New York City Opera's 1999 revival, and she pointed out that no one else is ever on stage during this scene. So Lizzie is up there all by herself, and she has to do everything all by herself for 10 minutes. And for Pansella in '99, the task was doubly difficult because the set that the City Opera used that year was this very stark, minimalist set. And Pansella told me that there wasn't a single piece of furniture on the stage for her to grab onto as she did this scene. So for Pansella, as for Lizzie, Everything had to be in her head, and yet somehow transmitted to the audience. I think Lizzie Borden, A Family Portrait, is a fascinating opera. It connects to the American post-war era and to at least one man's struggle to come to terms with what he'd lost during World War II. I think it also connects to some of the anxieties surrounding the birth of second-wave feminism in the United States. On the one hand, we might be tempted to view the operatic Lizzie as a symbol of women's lib. She kills her parents to free herself. Yet it's important, I think, to realize the limits that this all-male creative team posed to Lizzie's liberation in the opera. So we talked about how the opera has this mad scene, this tried and true convention that's used to demonstrate how Lizzie could have gone against the codes of Victorian womanhood. And the other thing that I'd point out about this opera is that it imprisons Lizzie all the way through to the final curtain. Because unlike the real Lizzie Borden, who as soon as she was acquitted, got out of her father's house and bought a new house, the operatic Lizzie remains inside that house. And so I hope you'll watch the opera for yourself, and I hope you'll focus in particular on the final scene, which is set some years after Lizzie's acquittal, and in which Lizzie appears as the spitting image of her father. And you can decide how confined and defined you think the operatic Lizzie continues to be.